Welcome, everyone. Today we have Nellie returning to join us. How are you, Nellie?
Oh, good. Thanks, Gabby. Thanks for having me on again.
You are so welcome. So Nellie joined us to share her story last week. She's a survivor of a generational family of SRA and of MK Ultra and experimentation. And it was a mind-blowing session where she really broke down the programming that children in these families are subjected to from 0 to 5 years, and in particular the use of drugs. So she was talking about scopolamine and her abuse that started in New Zealand and continues on to Australia. And Nellie is speaking out to really teach us about the structure of these cults and these networks and the tools that they use to program individuals and create mind control slaves. And I know we had an overwhelming response from survivors. They just found Nellie's detail, because it's just incredible what you've remembered in your lifetime and integrated now to be able to speak about. They just found it was so beneficial to be able to discover the deeper layers and see the big picture of their own story as well. And I love that it's by coming forward and survivors sharing, we're really connecting just so many dots and understanding, how these things have occurred and what's been done for so many decades and remained hidden from society as a whole. So I just think you're amazing, Ellie. I thank you so much for speaking out. And it's such a blessing that you're offering all this detail to other survivors so they can begin their healing journey as well. And I think another piece of feedback that people were commenting after watching your interview is it's just so shocking that despite you approaching the police and passing on so much of this important information about horrific crimes to children, horrific crimes occurring in our communities, absolutely nothing has been done. And I thought I would love for you to explain to the viewers a little bit more about just the whole reporting process and how that really ended up in you being more targeted as well.
Well, thanks, Gabby. Before I even started writing my statements, I was encouraged for a while to write statements, which I wasn't ready to do at that time. There was just so much more coming through. And that was from an Australian Federal Police detective for 2.5 years before I even wrote the statements, from around 2016 to 2018. Halfway through, while I was still being taken to things. So as I spoke about last time, they were still accessing me and taking me to things while I was programmed to write about them in so much detail. So I spoke to her for 2.5 years by the telephone many times. And then after all these promises of what she was going to do, suddenly she was transferred overseas. Halfway through 2018. I'd come forward about some pretty horrific stuff that I will get to in future sessions. And she even said that she had sent some things overseas about that to police over there, but nothing, no contact, nothing at all.
How ridiculous that there's one officer, there's one AFP officer that had so much crucial information.
Emails, everything as well.
Just transferred off your case. And I've heard that happen repeatedly with survivors.
Here in Australia aren't equipped to deal with these kind of organisations. They want people to believe the lesser evil, that so many individuals can suddenly commit all these crimes, and they don't want people knowing that it's actually an organised criminal organisation that is highly organised and does all this. And yeah, it's horrific. They just don't want it coming out. People wonder, they do, when you see it all and it's like another one and another one. Yeah, that's just so much brutality. It's just, yeah, these people are just pure evil that I'm coming forward about. And they have the knowledge to do it, the means to do it, and they've been doing it for decades.
So true. And they really make use of the media and also the police force and our politicians to portray, any of these crimes that come to light as just one-offs. So it's, you know, the crazy person, this one person that was doing these horrible things, rather than the truth of the situation being that it's a highly organized network involving many, and it's not a rarity at all. It's just all covered up.
No, so this was all told to me as I was growing up, what they were doing, how they were doing it. It was horrific to be stuck in that. And I know last session I spoke about the rape and murder of a young lady with her child in the room. I mean, it's just horrendous. And that was when I was 4. And that happened in Australia. So I was brought from New Zealand to Australia because in the early days, they actually based themselves in New Zealand. And they used to say, who would ever suspect little old New Zealand? Yeah.
Isn't that true?
No one would ever suspect that we would be in New Zealand. And they would travel to places, commit the crimes, and they'd be out of that country before it was even discovered many of the times.
So highly organized, isn't it? It's just astounding.
Yeah. So they were Nazi based, and my father even told me that when he was at school, they had people there, Nazis, that had even changed their accent. So they blended into society. And I'm going to be speaking more about that later this session, about where that came from. And probably next session, I'll talk more about the different, who they were and how that's evolved and changed through the times, through the decades, as they've, evolved. A family member also told me that they were using the family name, to find, kill people in names that were pronounced similar to the family name. Different spellings, different pronunciations, but similar sounds. They'd change a letter in the name. And then eventually they even went to artificially inseminating a woman to give birth to a child, and that child would have a set destiny. Either be accused of being a rapist and have everything set up before that happened over decades, or go to jail for some crime when they were in their 20s, or be murdered, say when they were 15, all of that. So they were playing God. They call themselves God. And it's all because they've been given the keys passed down through experiments and everything that were done on people through the times. And also my handler used to speak to me and say that he was having to do 3 killings in a row, that I was taken to each one of them over a 2 to 2.5 month period. That was at the height of it, when I was taken to 3 by 3 per year.
Wow.
And that was so that he would advance in the organisation.
Wow. What sort of ages were you talking about with it being like the height of your use?
In my 30s and 40s.
Wow.
That's when it really started to, get pretty horrific.
Wow. It's just astonishing to hear, like you were saying about these children that are like literally just designed for roles from birth. Just the level of organisation and planning that goes into.
And the patience and the waiting for decades for these people to go through certain programming at times, be set up with other witnesses to be a bad person, like be programmed to say or do things around people, to be lumbered with a mental illness or something, diagnosis. Yeah, that's what they did. So today I'm going to be talking more about how the organisation creates a full beta monarch slave, because that's what they called me. That's what their terminology was. And the methods that they used, which I started with last session, and I'll continue that on this session, as well as more of the breaking of the mother-baby bond, and that was caused by lobotomies done to my mother and also to another younger family member. And next session also being taken to one in Antarctica as well.
It's just huge operations, isn't it?
Yeah. So a bit of background about my family was my father went to a university in New Zealand. This is after the training by the men at his high school who had changed their accents. And he was a football player. And what they would do is they would use drugging on the other members of the team and the opposition team and make him look like a star, because everyone else was falling over their feet. And I'd have managers there and everything. And so that's how he got a scholarship.
Oh.
So he got a scholarship, which was they needed a cover for him to go to the USA. So he went to Berkeley, which is renowned for these types of things. And eventually, like, he did a lot of stuff over there that I'll get to eventually, to make himself sealed into this organization. A lot of stuff in America went on between 1960 and 1967. Huge stuff, which is also part of the first name of the organization that I'm bringing forward, but it's going to take a bit before I do that. And then there was a meeting with my mother, who was from Scotland, and she was under Ewan Cameron, who was a Scottish psychiatrist, and he was based at that time in Montreal. So she was taken to Canada to do some more nursing studies. There's a lot of nurses in the family, and she was programmed under him.
Wow.
And then my father went to have a meeting, introduction with her in Canada, met up, married within 6 weeks. She was under programming to get married within 6 weeks and then be brought out 6 weeks later, apparently on a ship, to the land of milk and honey, which is New Zealand, 12,000 miles away from her family. Yeah.
Just really highlights how international and how connected all of these operations are.
And one thing that was set up within her that I spoke about last session was when her little sister was killed by the man in the car and run over. And it was a form of escapism for her. That was the cover that they programmed her to believe, that she needed to get away from that and it would be a new start in life. So there's always a cover for everything. So she was brought out, had her first son, who was killed in front of her, as I spoke about last session, and then we were conceived, the twins. It's still in the 60s, late 60s. That's the bit of the background story to start with. And in the family home, all my brothers were always under to start with. I'm not so sure about my teenage years. I think they brought them out into more reality because I was so hidden. But around me, they were fully under, different cocktails of things. I was even programmed to find it in the food. And I'd see powder below the meat that we were eating, and then it was too late, I'd already eaten some, and then I'd think in my bedroom, oh no, in a minute it's too late. It's too late. Can't walk out the house, can't go and find anybody. And then go to sleep. Wow. So they're always bringing me to the brink of the knowledge and then putting me under many, many times. Then I was basically brought out to my 40s, where they were giving me more of my memories back, lessening the scopolamine and other drugs for times, putting me straight under again for the horrendous stuff, and then yeah, more memories were coming through, and by then I was completely isolated from my brothers. Everything was set up, I'll get to that later, to make a big rift in the family. So I wasn't able to have any family support when that happened, completely isolated. And before that, my twin brother was only brought around me to bring food in or take me to where food would be drugged, and unwittingly. And I would always see the men in suits around, always guarded everywhere I went my entire life.
Wow, it's just such a story of being so isolated, even from the druggings, which are obviously isolating you because of your perception being altered so much. But, it was such a deliberate cause of division between the siblings of your family, which I hear so often from survivors. It's like they've created this chaos within the family dynamic to mean that you can't ever unite and really, heal and recognize what's going on. Everyone's placed and programmed quite separately as well.
Yeah. And back with the family name being targeted and used by a family member, my twin brother even said to me one day when I first brought out some statements that I sent to all the family and cousins and everything, "You're ruining the family name." I'm ruining the family name. So my father had set up that to happen within the organisation to advance. And then it was always the black sheep would get the blame for that. So when I brought out the first level of memories way back in 2014 and sent them to people around Christmas time then, and that cut me from everybody, I was the one that was blamed for ruining the family name that had been done for decades by my father.
And that's really, that's a shame, and the guilt programming just being enforced, isn't it? When, these are the people that are abusing.
They'll do it and they'll blame me for it.
Yeah.
And that's their motto. They will do the crimes and always have a patsy, a person to be blamed for it and go to jail. They actually said that they get more out of placing somebody in a jail for years of their life than killing somebody, because the effect, the pain was more.
Wow. So it's really like they just thrive off of this energetic suffering of humanity that they're able to leech off of.
I was always drugged to do things without thought. And with scopolamine, like when you're fully under it, you can only remember every 3 seconds. So you're completely living in the present. You have no past, you have no future. And that's the way I lived for most of my life. And they would set up blockers. Like when I first came to the next town after the first town that I was in, they set up the blocker with the boys that I had seen just before my rape, that they had done it, and that they would run, because I was so young and I was programmed to think that they could run to my new house and still find me. And so that was a blocker to stop thinking about the past town that I lived in and what had happened there.
Wow. So the blocker was like a
the whole way through to stop you from wanting to think about the past.
Yeah.
And then they would program me to think about that, and then the blocker would be there, and it's like, no, I don't want to think about that. That's too much. That's way too scary. Being a 5-year-old.
Wow.
And onwards.
Yeah. And so you're constantly pushed forward into these new situations and having to cut off everything, all of your experience from the past, which would isolate you as well completely.
When we moved, toys were taken, anything with a memory would be taken in those days. Never see them again. Like if I finally, they would do something like they would let me out with a friend, and I would find $10 that was placed on the road. And then I would use that to buy something. And at that time, I think I was a bit older, I bought like a koala, which had an Australian connection, and it had little plastic paws. And I was so nervous when we were moving holding onto this koala because they had thrown everything else of mine out. And it made like an indent in blood in my hand. And we've been driven away from this next house to the next place after that. And then more blockers were set up that I wouldn't think about that last town as well.
Wow.
It's constant.
It's really fracturing your identity as a child, isn't it? You've constantly moved, you lose your possessions, your toys are the biggest thing in your life as a
Friends,
child.
no more contact. Yeah.
Schools change, friends change, the neighborhood changes.
Yes.
What a confusing time.
Yes. And in my late 20s to early 40s, they moved me about 20 times. More than 20 times. I was moved in my lifetime to over 54 houses so far, more than 54.
Wow. That's a lot of moving.
They would always create a big event before their event and one after that I'll get to this session as well. That's one of their tactics that they use. I can remember at the new house that I moved into with my family, being outside or brought outside, and my father, all my brothers are around, but my father's looked at me and said, go and find your favorite tree, go and run to your favorite tree, and he'd repeat things 3 times. So I had to run up the narrow alleyway behind the garage. And what he'd done is he had upturned a whole lot of planks of wood that had nails stuck through them. There's about 6 in a row. So of course I stepped on a nail, which is also biblical as well. And then my mother called me stupid for doing that. She was there right there at the time as well. And I was called stupid, which they would call me stupid right through everything, because stupid is to be stupefied. So if you're stupefied with the drugging, then you're just called a stupid when you're around these men and people that are programmed to say that as well to you.
Wow.
Because stupid means stupefy with the drugging to them.
Wow.
And that would happen when I was taken to big events as well. They would also say things like, you're useless, you're just standing there because you can't move under the drugging unless they tell you to move, and that you're stupid because you actually are, you're stupefied. That's what it means. Just
another layer of control, isn't it?
So you're always drugged to do things without thought. Like if your handler or one of the handlers, one of them was my father, tells you to do something, you do it immediately because of all the background that's gone to get you to that point.
Yeah. And would you say, Nellie, that's because of the fear as a child of the repercussions of the punishment? Like that's just how it's layered in with all the previous experiences of, any time that you try and avoid doing what they tell you to do, it's a very, very bad outcome. So it just keeps you following their directions.
Yeah, and they also did something to me when I was starting school. My father, after I'd been at school for maybe a week or 2, I'm not sure about timelines because I was always brought under and brought out. I wasn't always at school. And also Leeks and Foster would also be in the admin, making sure that any school roles were changed to reflect that I was at school. And then he had other people do that. So that's the extent that they go to. And that happened right through my schooling. And I've seen it done to other children's schooling as well. They're in the admin. And they even brought me into admin when one of the handlers was in there in a suit with a receptionist right under and pointing, put her name there, and then looking at me and sneering just to show me that this is how they operate and this is what they can do.
Wow. So not even the school was going to pick up when you were missing. Unbelievable.
No, you're only sent to a school that they have under control. Yeah. So one of the things they did to me was my father pulled me aside after I'd been at school and said that, do you know the nursery rhyme, Mary had a little lamb, and that Mary was my second name. That was my birth second name. And of course I nodded, thinking, why is he speaking nicely to me? Because he'd always start off nice before the horror set. And fleece as white as snow, followed her to school one day, and our men will be following you every day you go to school.
Wow.
So that's what he said in a menacing voice. We are watching you, everything you do. Don't put a foot wrong. We are mighty. We are strong. There are so many of us. You don't stand a chance. And we will get you and punish you if you do anything wrong. So I wasn't even allowed in the end to turn around and see who was following me. I'd see the cars go by. The men would be dropped off further ahead of me. So they'd be doing a stalking in reverse rather than following you stalking. They'd be coming towards me and giving me a sneer, which would confuse me to think, couldn't be, you know, they wouldn't know where I'm going already. But they were always there to walk towards me. It's like a stalking in reverse. And that's the way it was done my whole life. They would be walking mostly towards me, instead of giving me a look to keep me in check, to keep me in the altar that I was put in when I was let out, whichever one that was, to suit the different, whatever was going to be happening that day.
It's just such an unbelievable level of control they have over your environment, over everyone in your life. But these handlers being around you, it's just astonishing.
Yeah. And what would make me stay awake longer for events was they would put me in ice baths, because when you're freezing cold, and this happened especially when I was moved to Australia later in my teenage years permanently, rather than be just taken there, they would, because New Zealand was so cold, they didn't need to do it as much, but they would, because I was so cold, I would have to get into boiling hot baths after events that were too hot to even stand in. We'd be scalded, but it would heat me up fast because I was always underdressed when I was taken to Lake Alice or to different events. And New Zealand, particularly where we were, was freezing cold. There'd be frost all the time. Yeah, and then when I was moved to Australia, it was the ice baths that they'd put me in, and then I'd be underdressed for the weather, and taken to things to keep me more awake, because you're so cold, you're having a shivering feeling at times, so it would keep you more awake for longer.
Wow. And I imagine your whole body
that they used.
Your whole body would be in shock as well, obviously from the event, but then also from being so cold, your body goes into shock as well.
So one day my father came into my room, and I was already they started me at a Catholic school for their reasons. They had many reasons for that, so that I would learn about Jesus and God. And when they would do things that were so different from that, I would have more horror and realizations, create more fear. So my father said the story about Cain and Abel, which I'd just been programmed to read either at school or in the house. And he made the analogy that my twin brother was Cain and that I was Abel, and that Cain killed Abel. So this was when I was still 6 years old.
Oh my gosh.
So that it created a fear of my twin brother.
Of course.
Who was later always put above me. He would come in with messages that I'll get to later, stay very briefly in my room, and then leave. Like he'd only be in there just to deliver the message through the organisation of something that I needed to know, to create more fear or awareness of what was going on. And then he'd leave. So they would use other people to bring messages to you, not just the programming in your head.
Just that deliberate enforcement of fear as well, Nellie, on a child, just to completely, create all this anxiety and, just panic, for a child to think that a family member is going to hurt them, just that anxiety of living with that. And we know they do that to control. We know that once they put our minds into that state of fear, we're more easily controlled. So it makes so much sense. They were like literally introducing that fear every possible opportunity for you as a child.
But not just fear, even my likes and dislikes. Like my twin would bring me into his bedroom very rarely, and he'd say, listen to this music, and he was given an old radio and it would be playing some kind of music, and I'd be mesmerized, like being given mesmerizing drugs, so that I would end up liking that music. Wow. And this would happen even more in my teenage years. He'd do the same. He'd come in and say, I've just heard this, put this on, and it would be certain types of music. So I was always being programmed to like what I was programmed to like, that they had chosen for me. So everything was chosen, not just my clothing, but music taste, food likes, everything, colors. My favorite color at the time would be chosen and programmed in me. It was complete control.
Wow.
There was no me. Yeah. But there was deep down. But
all of this programming to take away your identity, and it's just astonishing, just to think, our children are learning how to make choices and learning what they like, and yet, in these generational families, it's been set up so that's even taken away from you. And that's such a critical part of, children becoming independent and maturing, is to have that independent thought and to be able to make choices. And yet they use that in the opposite way to control you, because you've never had the opportunity to choose for yourself. It's always been programmed in. It's just, so planned, isn't it?
Yeah. And the fear would go on to, like, my twin would come in and say, he'd be in a heightened state, and I would, as usual, be in my bedroom, not allowed out, and he'd say, I just saw Dad, and he was on his bike with a girl. And I'm looking at him going, a girl? And he goes, yeah, on the handlebars. And he went into the forest behind us with a girl a bit older than you. And I would just think, that's really weird or whatever. And then he just exit. So all his messages were very, very brief, just to create some kind of horror about what my father was doing. And I'd just start to get something, then it would go. So every 3 seconds. Even I remember one day my father got me and all my brothers to walk up to the shop, and it was the first time that it happened. And my youngest brother was quite young, but he was walking. And so we walked to the corner, like the local shop, and the man in there kept going to the back to get us lollies, and then giving us extra lollies. And then as we were walking back, my twin brother was programmed to suddenly stop while we're eating our lollies. Oh, they put drugs in these.
Oh, no.
Drugs. And drugs make you go to sleep and things like that. So he said all that sort of stuff that he was programmed to say after we'd started to eat the lollies. And then we looked at the lollies, and then we just kept eating them because couldn't remember what he just said. We just kept going.
Wow.
I remember that now.
What an awful feeling through your life of just realizing too late that the drugs had been introduced, and like you've got, who knows, hours a day of just dealing with the consequences of that as well. It's just cruel. It's absolutely cruel, just letting people know that they've ingested this and what's coming.
And just before that, we'd gone out of the house, the man with the big head and the American accent had arrived. And I remember having a thought as I got closer to the house, oh, they're doing something to my mother. And I think it was like electric shocks while we're out of the house, which they didn't always do. They do them at Lake Alice, but she was obviously having some type of programming, because when we got in the house, she wasn't there. Yeah. And the electric shocks would make me throw extreme fits in the classroom. I remember I threw maybe half a dozen over a couple of years that I remember. And my twin brother would even remember these. Years later, he was programmed to have a memory and he brought them up. But what would happen is I'd be dropped off to school on those days. I wouldn't have to walk. And they had something in my system that had delayed the convulsions from the electric shocks. So within minutes of being in school, usually while the prayer that was really triggering was being read out, I would start swaying and think, what's going on? My head would be screaming, like my ears would be screaming. The whole level of the lights would be really bright. And I'd try and stay up. So I was always programmed if I ever fell, I'd be kicked. So I always had to stay up. Used to feel really bad about falling, couldn't fall. And then it's like a noise like huge butterfly wings flapping on the ceiling. Wow. And that's what it was told to me it was like as well, like the beta wings flapping on the ceiling. Wow. And helicopter noise like whoosh, whoosh, like really loud. And I'd fall and maybe my chin would land on the desk in front of me and I'd start convulsing. And I'd still be in a semi-awake state then. And the nun would always keep people away from me who crowded around it. I'd be fitting, but I'd be in a sort of awake state to actually remember the fitting, but I couldn't control myself.
How scary.
Yeah, so that happened quite a few times until the nun teacher, Catholic nun, was programmed to tell my mum off about it, like, why haven't you taken her to see somebody one day? And I remember feeling like I needed to hide that. And my mother had come to the school and I can remember the teacher giving her a huge telling off kind of thing about that. And then eventually I was taken somewhere by my mother, who was driving extremely like stiff because she was under. She had to take me to a place near Wanganui to have things put all over my head that was really triggering for me by a man who was also under, and have like hearing tests and things like that, and whatever they did with those things on my brain to see what was wrong with me, but they were inconclusive as far as I know.
Wow.
Mm.
How scary. And it's just shocking for you to be reliving the sensations and the experiences during your electrode torture later on when you're more conscious.
And in front of my peers, my school friends and that, yeah. And then on the way back from that place, one of the men was in a truck and they passed my mum in the car and he put his whole body out of the truck and threw a stone that hit the windscreen right next to me, so glass went into my eye. So that was like a warning.
Wow.
Yeah, don't talk, basically.
Be quiet.
Mm-hmm. So another thing that they did was many men and my father would take us to that satanic killing field, the map that we saw last time. And we'd have live burials. So I would have to get in the box first. It would be a box made out of wood and balsa. And later my father would bring balsa wood into the house and make planes for my brothers and stand me to watch. And then I'd sent back to my room, but the balsa would bring back something fearful and then anxiety, and I'd be shaking, but I wouldn't know why.
Is balsa a type of tree? I haven't heard of that before.
I think so, yeah, it's a thin wood and they can make children's toys out of it as well. They used to back then. And I'd hop straight in. He'd go, get in like it's a game. And I'd hop straight into the box. A lot of men would be around. And I'd find out later they were men that he was training, younger men.
Wow.
Because everyone trains in hierarchies. And I'd gladly hop in like a game, hoping or programming those thoughts and those feelings. And then the top would be very too small, so I'd have to be curled up inside. And the top would be nailed down on top of me, and then you'd hear the dirt hitting it as you were buried under the dirt. And as they were doing that, I'd hear my father's voice saying, "Don't breathe too much because you'll run out of air in there." So I'd be trying to not breathe as well, and my head would feel like it was going to explode, and you'd wonder how long you were going to be in there. I'd eventually be let out, and all you could hear was your heartbeat, and the fear from the darkness, and just the fear that you wouldn't be let out, because I'd say that as well. It's going to leave you here forever. You're going to die in there. And then eventually it would be ripped off, and then my little brother would be made to get in, and I'd be led away, hearing his cries, because he was able to cry at that stage. And everyone left then with me, saying we're leaving him there overnight.
Oh, no.
So he was my most tortured brother. He had to go through that. And I don't know whether he stayed all night or what happened or how long, but just the lump in my throat that I remember having at that age, that I always carried through my life about things, and couldn't access why I had this huge lump in my throat, and feeling sad, like beyond sadness.
It's such a horrific part of remembering, to remember the children that you were forced to witness. You know, there are other children being hurt, but also being in that position of being under such complete control that you're unable to do anything. So, oh, Nellie.
Yeah. I was always drugged, as far as I know. It was relentless, and it was in the food and drink, as well as things that they'd put over my mouth when I was taking to things, but that would always give me a headache. They didn't do that often. It was more the drugging, the scopolamine, the cocktails of drugs that are just off the scale. Like, these are drugs that governments don't even know about with potency.
Wow.
They are, pharmacists would have no idea about the potency either, many pharmacists. And then other times they would put tubes down my nose to feed me with the drugs as well. Other than that, I was starved from food with before certain events, because they didn't want you choking on your vomit. So they would starve you. So eventually I went down to 39 kilos in my late 20s. I was down to about 39 kilos because they had stepped up the events that they were taking me to. And yeah, I was extremely thin.
Wow.
And they used to weigh me. Yeah, everything, like, because of the drugs they use, they're always monitoring your height, your weight, to know the exact effect that it would have to the most minuscule difference. So everything had to be weighed and sorted that way.
Yeah, so scientific, the experimentation. They knew it.
Extreme.
And situations where people don't have access to food is another form of mind control in itself, just like the sleep deprivation and all of the other programming. It really creates a situation where people are more easy to program, because your mind can't think straight when you haven't been eating. You're not as clear, you know, you're more susceptible to this programming.
Yeah. And they even had my mother being set up as the martyr of the family. So they would have different roles for people, and she would verbally tell us she was going without food so that we could eat sometimes. So that was also set up. So she was always the martyr.
Yeah. And so you couldn't feel good about eating because you knew someone was suffering for you to eat. So, you know,
yeah, we would feel bad about eating as well. So that was all part of it too. So they kept all the files and everything was videoed. Most things were videoed. I was told in my 30s that they had thousands of hours of video of me by that stage, to show with their training of other people, other men, what they were doing, how they were doing it. So these were kept on file. So after I'd walked to school a couple of times with my twin brother, I remember one morning my father called him away in front of me, and I went to listen, as I was programmed to, and he was telling my twin not to walk with me anymore. This was to further isolate me. So I remember I was trying not to get caught, even though my father knew I was listening. Everything was double-edged. So I walked away and started walking to school, and then my twin brother came racing past me really fast, because he was called a sissy if he was seen walking with me. That's the way they did it. And I heard my father say that, you don't want to be a sissy, do you? And you go, no. So yeah, if you're seen walking with your sister, that's what the others at school will call you, and all that kind of stuff was said. So then I was made to walk to school on my own. And when I walked to school, in those days especially, I had all the program thoughts, because they would program all your thoughts for the duration that you were out in timing, and that was done day before, days, weeks before, depending. You are ugly. Even your mother hates you. Over and over and over in my head, everyone hates you. You are stupid. You are stupid, over and over and over. Always, you are. So it was like me saying, hurting myself by saying you are to me, to my inner person.
It's like they've taught,
and then eventually sometimes,
I was just saying
yeah,
that they programmed you to actually continue the abuse yourself, which is, you know,
continue the abuse on me. Yeah. And other programming was, I am this, I am that. So then I would think that they were my own thoughts as well.
wow.
So both ways we're programmed.
It's like they've got everything covered, right? They're just thinking of it from so many angles with this programming.
And things were done to always brutalize my younger brother in front of us. And we were stored useless, not able to help. One particular one was on a Christmas morning. I think it was the first Christmas that we celebrated. So I was around 5 or 6 years old. No, I would have been 6. And my father came into my room first and pushed me awake. And then because of the drugging, I remember going back to sleep. And then my twin brother came in to say that something was going on. He'd heard noises out in the lounge room, and he went back to his room, and we could hear this yelling, and we both looked out and we could see my father with my most tortured brother. And he was a footballer, my father. So what he did was he got my younger, most tortured brother in a headlock first, and then picked him up like he was a football. And then he threw him at such speed, the length of the hallway, so that he smashed with his neck and his head into the wall above his bed and fell down on the bed. I remember looking, knowing that I wasn't allowed out of my room, but I wanted to rush, and I took a couple of steps, went back to my room. Saw my mother come out then, and she was saying that she wanted to help him, and I was thinking, is he still alive? He was just motionless. And my father came storming huge steps up the hallway and pushed her out and said not to go in. And she kept saying, but I want to see if he's okay. I want to see if he needs a doctor. I want to see if he's still alive. And my father said something like, yep, he's still alive. And I remember shutting my door thinking, is he alive or is he not? He didn't know if he was still alive, but he was. I don't know how.
It's just so awful.
He had his mother stopped from going and helping him again as well.
So
Yeah.
again, a
Brutality.
child alone with that brutality and level of abuse, so isolated, like there's no one coming to help.
Yeah. And he was also humiliated. So when he was 4 and too big for a high chair, he used to spit out his food. He didn't want to eat his food. And my father would shove his legs into a high chair, which he was too big for, and keep shoving him in until he actually got him in. And then he'd pick up the high chair and throw it against the wall with him in it. And the next door neighbour was programmed to come over and see if he could help. And my father just stormed straight out and told him to get back in his house. But he was also under programming. So we were all stood there to know that even neighbours were not able to help us.
Yeah.
Even though there was horrific noise and yelling and smashing. Yeah, no help, that no one ever helped. No one, everyone around us was drugged as well.
Part of the program. Oh, you'd just be thinking as a neighbour walked in, finally, there's someone outside of this family that might be able to assist, and they're drugged. Oh,
and yeah, the humiliation that I saw that my little brother went through, he was always called a dunce later on and things like that, and in front of everybody. Another brother was told that he was meant to have a girl's name, and that name was often called to him as well. So it was a lot of humiliation stuff that, yeah, they didn't like.
It's like they've created this hierarchy within the family, isn't it? Like this child's to handle and pick on this child, and this one's at the bottom, and
yeah,
it's just so evil.
That would interchange at times.
Yeah.
So at the table, I was always put at the bottom left, which is the lowest hierarchy. Yeah. My twin was always the top right, the right-hand man next to my father.
Mm-hmm.
My youngest brother was the top left. My most tortured brother was the bottom right because, yeah, of the hierarchies.
Wow. And it's just shown in every single thing they do, from even how you sit at the table. It's just constant, isn't it?
It's everything. And even Christmases now just always make me cry. I don't celebrate Christmas. They've taken all that away from me. I've really battled with that. Even that day that he was thrown, I don't think it was that day. It must have been another day because they always mix up days. And it was a Christmas morning pretend, but it was maybe 2 days later when he'd recovered. And then we were brought out of our rooms, still told that it was Christmas Day that day, even though it was 1 or 2 days later or 3 or 4, who knows? Because they would always mix up days, so you wouldn't know that there was a big gap.
Wow. And you're all under drugging as well, so that would make it even more confusing.
Yeah, you shut your eyes, you open your eyes, you think you've had a night's sleep, but you don't know that it's been 3 or 4 days or 3 or 4 weeks that you've been under. You don't know.
Wow.
But anyway, we're all brought out to open the presents. And my little brother wasn't allowed to, so he had to sit in a corner and was yelled at by my father that he wouldn't be getting his presents. So his presents were given to another family member, and I remember I didn't even want to open mine. I just didn't want them as a 6-year-old.
It's so awful. One
of my ear operations, I can't remember, it was the first or second, I think it was the first, so I was still 5. I was in the hospital and my father brought in nursery rhyme book. It was quite big and said it was from one of his fellow teachers at his school. And he said there was one story in there that was of significance for me, which I didn't understand back then. And it was a story of the little match girl. So that had multiple significance for me. Not only would I be isolated and left out in the cold, as I always was, isolated from the family without even knowing. but it was also to do with the project Matchbox and where their men came from, which I'll get to next session.
Yeah, so for viewers, Matchbox was Australia's version of Operation Paperclip.
Mm-hmm. And later on, I'll also talk about the artwork that I did and show some, because I was still under programming there, and they were even controlling my artwork and how I would do the art. And I even had paper clips hanging down some of the artwork. So they were wanting me to speak out about it that way as well, which is kind of hard for me to do artwork right now because I want to do my own artwork, not something that I was programmed with. But if you look at pictures of the artwork that I was doing back in 2017 especially, it was full of my past and programmed.
Yeah, and they say that art has this incredible way of bringing forward what's in your subconscious, so what you're not even able to understand consciously yet. So that's so interesting that was all reflecting out all of your programming before you even understood.
And I remember when I was first at school, my twin and we had a bit of alpha training, not much. I didn't have much, he did. This was probably just to let me know how it would feel for some of the deltas. Not that my twin was, but he had it to be over me. But my handlers do have a lot of alpha training. And I remember being new at school, fairly new, like in the first few weeks maybe. And my twin and I were standing next to a world map in front of the class, and the teacher would say a country, even the tiniest countries you could find on a map, and we would go straight to it and point with the programming. Because of all the run-throughs before that, under the different cocktails of drugging, including scopolamine, performance-enhancing drugs, we would point straight to anywhere, over and over and over, many different countries. We're still only 5 years old.
And how would you describe the alpha programming, Nellie? What would you say that programming is about?
Well, we were just standing there like this, and everyone, the other students are looking at us like, how do they know that? And we're just kind of like robotic, feeling robotic, very robotic.
Yeah.
Just doing the work very robotically. There's different levels of robot. Like my mother, after something happened that I'll get to soon, she became extremely robotic, but she wasn't alpha trained. But she just became robotic in how she made the lunches, got us off to school, did her job, that was it. She just had jobs to do. There was no talk between me and her, no connection. Yeah.
It's so hard. It's such a severing of the mother-child bond, which is so crucial.
Even with the mother around you, there's nothing. There's nothing.
And there's still no safety. There's no love. There's no touch, no compassion. It's just such a hard environment for a child to be. It's not even living in, but surviving in. You know, it's just so harsh.
So it works on a reward system too. So one night, my father came into my bedroom, as he often did, and he'd speak in a certain voice, and it would get scarier and scarier. And this time was a little bit different. And he was telling me that the next day there was going to be a competition at the school because everything was programmed. And that my teacher, and how much did I love my teacher, and she was a nun, and nodded, yes, I loved her, because she was the only person in my life that was showing me any love. She seemed to pick me out of everybody and be concerned about me, but that was still under programming. So that was the one thing that was getting me through all the brutality. And that she was going to do a little competition, and that I just had to remember the number 1. the number one, not 5, not 7, not 10, but the number one. So the next day we went to school, and as he'd said, in front of the class, she said, we're going to have a competition, and she had a picture of Jesus and a tinderbox that made a little sound when you pulled the lid off it, that was all inlaid with some kind of jewelry, maybe from India. And she said, I'm thinking of a number between 1 and 10. And someone said 7 or something like that. And then she looked at me and she kept looking. And I said 1. And so I got the first prize, which was the picture of Jesus. And then she did it again. And I said 1 again and got the other prize. And I remember all the other students looking at me like, how did you do that? So it's another kind of ESP training where you think, oh, I know it, it's number 1. You somehow feel it and you know it.
Wow.
When you've been programmed to do that, but you don't have a memory of the programming. You just have a memory of the outcome that you have to do.
It's all been pre-set up and programs for both you and your teacher. Incredible.
And then I'd go to people's friends' houses occasionally if I was allowed to, and we'd be dropped off. And I'd be in a huge anxiety, maybe wrenching my hands, really nervous, really anxious, very obedient around them. I was always taught to speak in a posh language. My mother had an accent, and she would be sitting me and my twin in front of her and repeating words, and we had to say it a certain way. So we sounded like we were okay, so that people wouldn't realize that we're being so abused. You know what I mean? Because you sound educated. And I remember one friend's mother was stood at the window, under programming still, but saying, for my benefit, I'm going to speak to her mother. I need to speak to her mother and find out what's going on. This is not right. And I'm thinking, my heart would go, oh, something's going to happen. You know, I don't really know anything about this, but I know that something's going to happen. And then my mother would come in, she'd arrive, which was rare then because it was normally my father that would do the pickups. And then gradually she was programmed to be allowed to do that, drive a car, do the pickups. And she'd walk in and she'd be kind of speaking in her posh voice. And she'd say, hi, I'm so-and-so, and I'm an obstetric nurse. I'm a midwife. And then you'd see the friend's mother visibly sigh with relief. Oh, can't be. If she's a nurse and she's a midwife, she's an obstetric nurse. No, I can't be. So that was also put into their minds to negate any way that I was presenting back then, that I couldn't help after I'd been taken to horrific things.
Wow, they've always got the cover story there, don't they, to smooth any questions or, you know, anyone that's actually viewing from the outside thinking what is going on, make them doubt themselves and continue.
And that would go into their mind as well.
Yeah.
And not only that, but they would use nurses to actually go into the hospitals and learn more about the methods and ways that they were operating to be able to go in and do things. Yeah.
Wow.
And I even have a fiance of a family member who has been promoted heavily through hospitals to be doing that as well, unwittingly, like not even to their knowledge, to the point that they were even taken to the notice board where something was suddenly taped up by one of the handlers, who I know, and she was stood in front of it, and it was some big promotion job, and of course she got it, and then she's elevated and elevated and elevated to the point now that she's teaching nurses. So this is the hold they have over people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is the structure, isn't it? Once they've got control of someone, and it's only then they actually go up, they're promoted, they gain more prestigious positions, and then they're unfortunately able to either control or indoctrinate other younger members as well. It's just like an
And it's not just learning about medicine, it's also the scientists they can access, anyone that has huge knowledge about anything to do with warfare, they can access and create, pit people against each other, pit countries against each other, and create things to happen, which is their main aim, which I'll get to later. I've already started that.
Makes so much sense, you know, because you often question, like, how do they manage to, you know, cause all this change and lead, you know, movements in our society so easily, but realizing that it's done under drugging.
Yeah.
It makes so much sense how successful they've been able to be over the last decades and get away with it completely.
Yeah, and everything's, like I said, the ripple effect in or out. Like a ripple can go out, but it can also come into the target. So everyone is set up around whatever target they have. The next one I'm going to be talking about concerns the map of the satanic killing field that I brought in last session. And I remember coming out to the table, woken up in my room, everyone's already at the table, and my father suddenly announced to my mum that he's going to take me looking for mushrooms. And that was a trigger word for her. And she's like, no, please don't take her. Please don't take her. Please don't do that to her. Like something bad was going to happen to me. And he was ignoring her and telling me to go and get my gumboots on, get dressed. And so I did. And then she still tried to stop me from going because he'd told her previously that he was going to kill me, to give her all this anxiety. And then taken up the back path to the back of the house, through the fields, to a point where he pointed to all these houses around and said, there's a special place that you're going to be going to soon, that none of these houses will hear anything or see anything. They'll all be asleep. And that did happen. That's something I'm going to be talking about soon. That concerns something major.
Wow.
Yeah.
So there's this constant programming happening of learned helplessness that there's no one that's going to see, there's no one that's going to come. You're just sort of isolated and at the hands of, you know, these monsters. There's just no help coming. It's just horrific.
So one thing that they did was they set up a huge self-focus on myself. So my father would come into my room at night and tell me, after he'd given me books to read, this is still when I'm 6 years old, and I could read quite well because of the programming and all being taught behind the scenes. So I'd have pretty major books to read. I knew all about Helen Keller, Joan of Arc, all of that. So he'd say things to me like, I'm going to make you into Helen Keller. You're going to be blind and deaf and dumb. We're going to make you dumb as well. So he'd say things like that, or I'm going to make you into Joan of Arc and we're going to burn you like a witch at the stake. And these are all stories that I used to read about, but he'd twist them into becoming about me. He'd also shave me. So he shaved all my arms continuously so that I'd grow arm hair and be fully focused on that and that being ugly. He shaved my moustache here, shaved my fingers even. So I grew hair on my fingers, shaved my legs. So I had thick, long leg hair for most of my primary schooling that I would be focused on and trying to cover because it gave me a bad feeling because of what he was doing to me. And that would create stuff for you to be thinking about when you were out.
Yeah.
Also another way of deferring from anything else that's happening. And filling your mind with other thoughts that they would do whenever you were out. So it's complete control in all times.
And it's really creating that negative thought, of yourself
As well,
by
yeah.
yourself, and not understanding maybe consciously why as well. It's just awful for a child.
Yeah, it instills some kind of self-hatred that you're always battling and negative thoughts about yourself. But mainly something to think about when you were out, that they knew that they could program this string of things in your mind over time that you would continuously be going around in your head. Yeah. And they would even do things like handpick other people, families from other towns to bring them to our town. So it was controlled that way as well. The right families to be brought in, all handpicked. Yeah, that's what my father told me. Like the friends I had back then, some of them came from different towns just before I arrived, all set up before I even arrived.
Wow.
And they were controlling who my friends would be at that time, for how long, things that would happen to no longer be friends with that person, but be friends with another person, and then go to their house and have more brutality happen at their house. So you're always moved around, not just the brutality would happen in your own house, you'd also go for friendship meetings with other friends in their houses, and brutality would happen there. You'd have lots of men come out of wardrobes, cupboards everywhere, and start kicking the children that were all together in the group. Be made to do different things with the children, all under programming, and this is what they've done for decades now.
I guess that's another way of isolating children, is they make sure that the other families that you're in contact with are other cult families. So no one outside of that's going to see it. Yeah, they're all under their own program.
They don't even know. They don't even know that they're being targeted and that their children are being targeted. The parents are put to sleep, and I'd even be shown by a certain friend, mum and dad are asleep. We don't know why. We're trying to wake them, but we can't wake them. And then all the men would come into the bedroom and kick them, kick the kids and kick me.
So awful.
And even like the handlers would be at, say, if I was allowed to do ballet, which I was when I was around 6 years old, more humiliation about that. The ballet teacher would target me and be telling my mum that I'd be bouncing around like a baby elephant and things like that. So all this cruelty that my mum would get off the phone from her and come straight through to tell me, all under programming. But they had an infatuation with bunnies. So we'd be dressed up as bunnies on the stage. The whole theatre would be under and brought to watch. Or the stereotypical American Indian, and with all the stereotypical dancing that would go with that. We'd have to perform this in front of people. It was all very bizarre. And all the handlers would be in the dressing room when we were getting dressed, and then I'd leave, but I'd see them.
Wow.
Men in suits. Very terrifying men. These are terrifying men.
It's interesting what you're saying about the bunnies as well, because we know that's such a symbol of, the beta programming of the mind control slave introduced, in your ballet, in things that are happening. So it's just another layer of that programming going in.
And even with the Easter eggs, my father would make sure that they were drugged. So he'd make a big show of hiding the Easter eggs that we had to go and find, and then we'd go to sleep straight after to be woken up to more horror. So even Easter coming up has a huge trigger event for me. Like, I just don't go near any shops that whole time. Try not to look at any bunny ears, chocolate as I go in, because
how hard is that?
always
everywhere.
wear earplugs and headphones, so I don't hear music associated with these special occasion days. So yeah, they take all of that off you with what they do to you. So the next thing's quite triggering. I was used as a cover for men to go overseas and look like they were my father. So one particular time I was taken to America, and it was told to me it was America, and I knew America because I've been told by the man with the big head, America. He'd spoken about it before and made me aware there was America, but I didn't know what America was, but I was told it was a big, big country when I was there. And I'm woken up and I'm in a camping ground. There's lots of other handlers around, and there's Selwyn Leeks Imposter, who was my main handler on these. And he's showing me like the caravan and other camping dwellings and walking through, and then all of a sudden we had to stand in a big line, and I'm wrenching my hands because I'm so scared. I'm still 6 years old. And there's a little boy standing by the stile just before the forest that we're facing. He's about 3 or 4. He's got blonde hair. And I know that he's around my little brother's age. And that's what's going through my mind at the time. And all of a sudden, his said sister was in the line with us. And she's been directed to go and stand next to him. And then she's been directed to go into the forest. And next thing, I know Christopher was with me, one of the other boys that was taken to the shooting of the cats and the chickens that I spoke about last time, and he had been horrifically hurt with boiling water poured over him. But he's standing next to me and he's shaking like he does, and there's a few handlers there as well. And next thing, she's been told to go into the forest, and the little boy keeps looking back in fear at the big line of us. And Selwyn Leeks Imposter, standing next to me, is saying awful things to him, and then turning around and telling me he's scared of the forest. He doesn't want to go in there. There's monsters in there. We've told him all about the monsters. He's seen the monsters. So this has been happening to him for a while. His parents are in one of the caravans or somewhere I'm pointed to, asleep, because I've put the parents and all the other people in the campground asleep. So all the parents are under, other kids are under if they were there. And this poor little boy, finally we had to stamp our feet in front of him. I didn't want to at first, but we had to do a menacing sneer on our face, and I didn't want to until I was yelled at viciously by Leeks Imposter too, and he was stamping his foot at the boy, directing him to go into the forest, yelling at him to go in the forest. There's no one else around. Everyone else is like, there's handlers all around the perimeter to make sure that there's no outsiders come into this. This is how they operate. Next thing, he's disappeared into the forest. He's finally turned and run. And I just caught sight of him running. So I turned to look at Christopher and try and console him. And next thing, me and Leeks Imposter are going through the same forest. And I'm noticing that there's even though it's all overgrown, very lush green, there's like a little trail going through it. So they have already made a kind of track trail that you could hardly see, but it was there. And I'm in bare feet, and I'm scared being in bare feet. And he has shoes on, Leeks Imposter. And next thing, we get up towards an embankment, and he says to me, the boy's already gone. And then he's picked up a trike. There was a trike there. And this is the trike, like very similar trike that I was allowed to sit on first time that I spoke about in the last session. And he's gone, well, he won't be needing this anymore. And he's throwing the trike, and it got quite close to me. I could feel it going past me. It almost hit me, and he's throwing it into the corner. And then he's helped me up the embankment, and there's gravel, and we're just standing there, and he's going any minute now. And next thing, a car comes hurtling towards us, and one of the other men in suits is in the car. And he's done a burnout sideways, come towards me, and gravel has gone into my legs from the car tires. and they're laughing and making comments about that. And then I'm being put into the back seat and driven away. And yeah, that happened. And I'll talk more about what happened after that, maybe after a little break.
Yeah. Just the terror that these children are being put through, it's just horrific.
Mm-hmm. So what they do is they set up huge events before a big event. And one of the ones that they set up was my father's sister's wedding. And I was still 6. And my mother was going to the UK to visit her family. And she was saying to my father, I was brought out to the bathroom, and they were saying, my father was saying, no, my mother's saying, I don't want to eat or drink. I'm not going to eat or drink any of the food anymore. I know what's going on. I'm not going to eat or drink. And I'm like, oh, I'm allowed to hear this. And my father's an actor, so he's putting on an act. Oh, you're going to miss my sister's wedding. I can't believe you're going to miss my sister's wedding. You can't do this to me. Just before my sister's wedding was meant to be the next day. Who knows how many days it was, but everything, time, they mix up time all the time for you. And she's adamant that she's not going to go and that she's already booked her flight. Under programming, they got her to do this so that she believes she was escaping something. And so at my sister's wedding, she was taken by my father away from the sister's wedding early, my father's sister's wedding, and apparently put on a plane. Who knows if she was even put on a plane or just put straight into it? Who knows? But so she was away for quite a while, so we didn't see her. But I would see the man with the big head in the lounge room. And what they'd done is I was programmed to come into the lounge room, see my father. They were all grinning. And I was horrified to see him. And then I turned around and I actually saw the actual Selwyn Leeks. So they had brought him in and he was wearing yellow shorts. And that was significant. And he was trying to hide by the curtains and saying, oh, you have to do something about her now, she's seen me. And I remember looking at him and then running, because I was programmed that he was Leek's imposter anyway, like they were both the same people. So I've had a flash of what his face looked like as well. And then I've run to my tree and stayed there for a while until my twin brother was sent around to come and get me and say, there's this horrible woman in the kitchen and she's putting stuff on the sandwiches out of medicine bottles and she hates children. He said that he'd gone in to ask her if she wanted help and she said, go away, I hate children. And he said something like, she looks like a nurse. So I went in and there's this older lady, very thin, and sure enough, there's 3 brown medicine bottles, which I was later programmed to collect later in my life, a whole collection of brown medicine bottles. Wow. But she's got the 3 medicine bottles and she's dipping a knife into them and pouring stuff, and it's going on food that she's got in front of her. And then I've just run away because she's turned around and said the same thing to me. I hate children. So I thought I'd better go.
Wow. Sounds like a good idea getting out of there.
So she's getting ready for a party. But before that happened, I remember coming to, and I'm in a car, and there's my little brother next to me, and there's 3 other men in there who are pretty nasty. They turn around, keep sneering at me. They're making a commentary amongst themselves. And eventually other headlights go on up and down the street, the old country road, in both directions, and they're like, now it's time, screaming into over little cattle things and into the back of the forest, and it's the satanic killing field that I've spoken about. And I'm met by my father there, and he has a cloak that he's meant to put on. So he puts it on, and other men have black cloaks on, as me and my little brother are led into past all these white stones that are all around a table. And we stood up and faced and adjusted position. We had to be in the right position, so they keep moving me. Then I had to move here, then inches over. Then I noticed that there's a shape in front of me. I'm at the bottom of a table, and it's a boy under white sheets. And I keep looking at him, looking and looking. And in my head, that programmed me to think it was Christopher. And I keep looking. And eventually I think, no, Christopher has a pointy chin. This little boy has a straighter jawline. And long story short, they killed the boy in front of me. And every time I went down, or my little brother went down, we were propped back up to look and woken up to keep looking.
Wow.
Another family member does a little boxing two-step dance of glee that they do. Made to drink blood in a chalice.
Oh, no.
I had to watch the entire thing being done.
Horrific for a child to experience all of this. I'm so
And
sorry.
it doesn't end there. And then we're led away, shaking, absolutely, like you're going out of your mind. Brought back to the house. I don't know when, whether it was straight away or after a day or two, but I remember being brought into the house, and me and my little brother are made to kneel and say a prayer and put our hands like this. And we kept shaking and crying, feeling absolutely horrific inside. And then I'm given a St. Christopher on a leather scarab, and I had to wear it around my neck. And I hated it. I didn't want to wear it. It had a bad feeling for me. And then I took it off, and then my mother came in straight away immediately and put it back on me. And I had to wear that to school from then on underneath my uniform.
Wow. And so that was just like an unconscious reminder linking you to, this horrific event that you just witnessed.
Oh, and that happened after my mother had left because she wasn't around. Sorry. So she was taken away for that. So, yeah.
It's just awful.
And then brought back for the scarab around the neck.
Really makes you wonder, where was your mum during that time? What happened? And I guess we'll never know.
So it was the same boy that I was taken to in America for them to bring back. And he'd been kept in captivity for quite a while. So this is over a couple of months at least. I don't remember having a birthday that year or any other years. It could have even been possibly done on my birthday, the killing, because they do special occasion days, and it was around that time. So he was kept in captivity for at least a month or two before they killed him in New Zealand. Very near where I lived, in the same block of where I lived. Yeah.
Poor little boy. That's
and I know his name, and I've sent the statements to the police, and there's been nothing. I went and found his name. I found it by accident.
Incredible.
And before my mother came back, my father set up an incident, and the men above him as well, where my twin brother came and said that my father was on the phone and that he'd been listening, and that it was my mother and him on the phone, and that my father wanted to see me. And so I stood in front of my father, and he's on the phone to my mother, apparently my mother, who knows who it was, because they're very good actors, they're all trained in acting. And he's saying, yes, I'll hand myself in, and he's laughing to me, like he's actually laughing, like he's not going to do it.
Wow.
Yes, of course, come back. You need to come back, and I'll hand myself in as soon as you get here. And then laughing again while I'm stood in front of him, to know that he's not going to do that.
Yeah. But it's like they just take so much joy in letting you know that they're untouchable at all times.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then there was a big event where my mother was arriving home from the UK. She'd finally come home. My father had gone all out and invited everybody, all the aunties and uncles. I could hear them coming into the house. This is for the food that's drugged by that nurse with the medicine bottles. And music's played. And just before they came in, he came into my room and he said, you know the game pickup sticks, which I talked about in the last session. And he said, well, imagine a big pickup stick, but it's not plastic, it's metal, and it's really, really sharp. And imagine that going through your eye into your brain.
Gosh.
I'm going to do that to your mummy. She's coming back soon. I'm going to do that to your mummy. I'm going to take your mummy off you. It's called a lobotomy.
Oh, Nellie.
And then I heard her coming in, and by then I'd forgotten all that because she can only remember a few seconds. I remember having huge anxiety and then joy that she was back, and then huge anxiety and joy. Finally, she's back. Maybe things will change. Maybe she'll, you know, things will get better. And I remember her coming in and everyone around her and the music's happening. And then a little bit later, my father woke me up again and I heard my mother in the hallway and two men's voices that I didn't know saying, we've seen, hello, so-and-so, we've seen that you haven't been eating tonight. So have some of this. And I heard her choking. So they had rammed some food down her throat. Then I heard her go down and they're talking about it and lifting her up. And then she's being dragged into her bedroom. And then later my father's telling everyone from the party to leave. And if they don't feel too good, to just pull over on the side of the road. That's what he always does when he's had too much to drink. And it's just the drink and they just need to pull over on the side of the road. So that would be in their mind. And they're all happily getting into their cars because the drugs make you feel very relaxed at times and very joyous and very happy. And I can remember everyone leaving and car doors slamming, and I'm wide awake by then, like my eyes are wide awake, like what's happening, what's going on. And then I can hear my mother and she's being brought out of the bedroom and she's saying, but where are you taking me? I don't want to go. I don't want to go. Then my father has yelled out, hey, Sal, reverse the car up the driveway, really loud, saying Selwyn Leeks' name, even though it wasn't him, it's Sel's imposter or whoever. But I was always made to believe, especially in the later days when all my memories came out, that it was Selwyn Leeks. Mm-hmm. And she's been put into the car and she's saying before she left the house, who is that? I don't like him. I don't like him. I don't want to get in the car. And my father's saying, we're going on a nice romantic drive. You and me going on a nice romantic drive. And then I could hear the car doors slamming. And then the car went the same way as Lake Alice. And I remember feeling horrified about that. And then I eventually, went out to it.
Wow.
In the coming days that I was awakened, I didn't see my mother. And eventually my father opened the door of their bedroom and I saw a shape of my mother lying facing the other way. And then we were only allowed to look very quickly. And then my father said, see, she's back, she's back, she's back. They always create big events. Eventually, my mother was brought out and put in the backyard on a chair. And my father's come and got all of us and we've all lined up, me at the very end. and all my brothers are allowed to go and give her a hug, and she has a black eye patch on one eye, and the other eye is looking very, very red and bloody still. And when it came time for me to have a hug, my father said, no, go to your room, you're not having a hug. Time to go. But before that, he was saying, remember your children, and she couldn't remember my name. She was mixing up all the names of all the children, all of us. She didn't know our names in those early days. And later, my father came in and said his best friend, who's one of the leaders, had sourced me a toy, but it was kind of from my mother, but also from him, but he'd found the perfect toy. And what it was a doll with a detachable head on a string. And when you pulled the head away from the body, it would talk as it went down. And my father said, see, it's lost its mind, it's lost its mind, it's lost its mind. And then he said, she's lost her mind, she's lost her mind, she's lost her mind, she's lost her head. She's lost her head, kind of thing. And that was my new toy. And he'd also said, I've made her into a mummy, not the mummy that you know, but a different kind of mummy. One that's all wrapped in bandages and put in a tomb, a dead one. So basically he was telling me that he'd taken my mother off me for good. Yeah. And she was always really struggling with that lobotomy, like always. She spoke different. She was huge anxiety. She didn't know which way to go sometimes.
Wow.
Made fun of, all sorts of names. She was Scottish, so she was called a silly Scots woman, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, really.
So they kind of just portrayed her as like the mad woman when they've actually lectured this
done
on
that to her. Yeah.
Wow. Oh, so much suffering.
So this is some of the things that they do within the family home.
Your poor mother, just like you, to be so completely stuck within that situation. There was just no way out.
And eventually when she got a bit better, I remember her coming around the house, and we were all lined up, me and two of my brothers, and telling us that one of my other brothers had the measles, and we'd already had the measles and mumps, and it took a week or so. And we knew that. We had memory of that. And she said that one of my other little brothers had it. And we're like, no, but we've already had it. Can't be. And then she went back into the bedroom, his bedroom, came back out, and her voice went all hoarse. And she said, he's got an eye patch on.
Oh, no.
And I remember turning, and I had tears in my eyes, and walking away and going, oh no, I've done that to him as well. Yeah. And then he was further targeted, and my father used to call him the dunce, make him stand in the corner. He was horrifically abused and had really hard times at school as a result of that with his peers. And
how old do you think your brother was when that happened, that event?
He was around 4.
Oh.
I was still around 7. He was around 4.5, almost 5, just before he starts school. This is what they do. They'll do it just before a child starts school, so that they don't see a difference in them.
They don't see a change.
Mm-hmm.
Oh.
Yeah. Even the Plunkett lady that I was taken to when I was around 4, quite late, because my twin had been taken before me. She was also put under and made to fill out stuff. And she used to say things to my mother. Why do you look so nervous? Are you taking your daughter to kindy? And my mother would lie and say, yes, every day. Yes, every day. And I remember looking at her saying, that's a lie. But that woman was also under. And it was all set up before we were allowed to go there. So then eventually the booklet was filled out all fine, and there's nothing to report to anybody.
There's no trace, is there? There's no evidence.
They cover every single trace with these families.
Wow.
Everything. There's no way out. No way out. No one will come and save you. No one will see. No one will remember. Nothing. So then my mother was brought out again to tell us the chrysalis story, which is an important story in these kind of cults. And they had a chrysalis growing on a branch out there, or glued. There was a monarch eventually that was glued to a leaf, so it couldn't move anyway, so it's all set up. And she's telling the story about the chrysalis and how it doesn't need to know its mother, and that all the DNA is genetics is transferred down without it ever meeting its mother.
Wow.
And all that kind of story. And then all about the monarch. So those stories were told through my mother by the organisation for us to know. Then I remember another monarch was let free and allowed to fly. And I remember the brother that had the lobotomy chasing after it, going, a monarch, a monarch. And I'm like, don't chase it. It was just such a horrendous thing to see what they'd done to him. And then that.
Wow.
You'd be programmed back to have those thoughts periodically in your mind, to have that horror, and then gone again. And there's nothing you can do. You're only awakened for that certain period of time and then put under again.
Wow. Just literally woken up to horror after horror after horror, and between each one, just
And then things got a little bit weirder, and I'd be taken to like family holidays that none of my brothers that I know of ever remembered. They were there. We would be taken to places like Foxton Beach, where there'd be a place there that my father had, and other families would come with their children, and I'd be woken up and be forced to get on top of one of the other boys, and it would be videoed. And by then they had me to a certain stage where my hips were moving automatically without my brain controlling my hips. Yeah. So that was towards my beta slave programming. That's where they were bringing that in, the sexual stuff, the programming that I don't have any memory of. I can't access that much at all.
Wow.
Not a lot. There comes a point where you start doing it and then it's all blank.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Obviously being programmed in under so much drugging that it is a program that just can run completely unconsciously.
Yeah. And I'd even been told by my father before I went blank, no, you're not doing it right. Do it as you've been instructed. Do it as you know. We've taught you. All that kind of stuff he'd say as well.
It's so awful hearing how the children of different families are actually used in together for this programming as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would be given things like LSD and hallucinate and in the home and be bouncing off the walls. My father would even give me a toy like a kaleidoscope. Everything had meaning when I was eventually given more toys. And it would be, he'd say, look in that, and you'd turn it. He'd show me how to turn it. See, it's all fragmented. That's you. That's what we've done to your brain. We've made you into what you're seeing in the kaleidoscope. And then he'd leave it in my room. So every time I'd look in it, I'd feel, when I didn't have those memories of what he'd said to me, I'd feel nauseous or anxiety, or there was something wrong.
It's just all these constant reminders to trigger back to the abuse. It's so awful.
Yeah. And then he'd do things like, he'd tell me to go into my mother's laundry and there'd be a little boy in there. he said his name was Christopher, but he looked different from the Christopher that I remember, but maybe it was him when he was a bit younger, I don't know. And he was automatically putting his hand like this, uncontrollably. And in those days, we had wringer washing machines with the two bars that would wring the washing out. And my mother would just stand there robotically, even though he's doing this close to the washing machine. I'd be told by my father to go and watch what was about to happen. Oh, and next thing, he'd put his whole arm in there and it would break his arm. Oh. But because he was under so much drugging, he didn't scream or yell or anything like that, maybe a few tears. Then my mother would take him back to his family, apparently, or who knows what happened then. And yeah.
Oh my God.
It's all sorts of horror. And I can remember being allowed at a friend's house and their mother and father, who were very loving. So I actually got chances to see loving parents. Were taking me and her for a drive to some restaurant. It was all programmed. When we got there, I remember seeing one of the handlers there in the restaurant, bringing out the food. And there was a stuff said about this pink sauce, and the mother and father were ranting and raving about this pink sauce. We couldn't have the food without the pink sauce. And here it comes. Here's the pink sauce. And I just knew, even then, I didn't want to eat it. And it tasted horrific. It tasted like it had, because I know what ketamine tastes like. I was given it. It tasted like that. Wow. Oily, vinyl, horrible taste. But they were like, this is great. This is great. And then on the drive home, they're zoning out and I'm really fearful, but they're still driving okay. But they're like really confused. They think they're going the wrong way. All that kind of stuff happened. So I was being taught that even at restaurants, the men are there and they're still going to be doing the drugging.
Wow. And this family obviously had no idea what was going on because it's not part of their lives. Wow.
So I'd be taken a lot to other people's families where the men would all come out and attack us, and that happened so many times. And then I'd be programmed the next day or two or whenever it was at school to look at the set jaw of the girl, the friend of mine, and I'd notice, yeah, she's got a set jaw. I've done that to her, like the clenched jaw and clenching when you've had electric shocks. Oh, no. So that would also be told to me. And then I'd feel guilty momentarily till that thought went, my fault, or program, my fault. I'm the one that's causing this.
Yeah, there's so much guilt and shame programs in. And the truth is, as a child in these situations, you're completely helpless. You know, as a good-hearted child, you want to be able to help these other children in any way you can, but even that's taken away from us.
Yeah. My father would even tell my mum that he had a job a couple of nights a week at a girls' boarding school on our street.
Oh, no.
And he'd take me for a walk up there, and he'd point to the windows and the doors, and he'd say, you don't need a key to get in there. I don't need a key to get in there. I go in there all the time and visit those girls. Shame about their boyfriends. They'll be getting the blame. I'm making lots of babies.
Oh, no.
Mm-hmm. He'd say things like that to me.
We hear this again and again, these monsters just finding access to children through schools, through sport. It's just horrific.
And back in those days, it would be the boyfriends that would be blamed for the pregnancy.
Yeah.
And then a whole lot of stuff when DNA tests came out later, much later.
Wow.
Talking about the early 70s here still, mid-70s. Yeah, so there's just so many different events. I can't possibly tell all of them, but another one that I particularly remember is being dropped off by my mother to another girl's house. So all these friends were always found for me. Yeah. And then I remember being in the kitchen and my father's in there. And this is the first time that I've seen the extent of how they operate. And he's telling the mother that she has to go in and throw her son, or me and the friend will be killed.
Oh my God.
And he's helping her get 4 drinks. And she seems very relaxed, even though he's saying this to her. I'm in quite a relaxed mode too, because I've still got drugging that's making me quite relaxed, just a little bit anxious. And he's pouring her drinks. And I remember then going into the lounge with the friend, and the little brother was sitting there just playing. And next thing, there's pickup sticks there as well. I felt ill when I saw them. I didn't want to play the pickup sticks. I didn't know why, but I felt like I should play with her. So I tried to play them with her. And the mothers marched in, picked up the boy and thrown him into the couch quite violently.
God.
And yelled at him and called him names. And she's gone out, and my father's sort of come in when she's done that to watch. And then she's brought in food for all of us, and I didn't want to eat the food. I felt sick, just in horror. And then she's come in and she's thrown the food away from him, which was, he had baked beans. And she's picked him up again and thrown him again into the couch. And she did it 3 times. And then, because of the memory, certain memories going first and then elongating out, all I can remember is not my father there by the end, just her doing that. My mother then soon came to pick me up and said, how was it? And I said, she kept throwing her son and hurting him, because that's all I could remember by then.
Wow.
Yeah.
Own mother coerced into doing that.
Yeah. And that's what they do. That's a Nazi thing. They'll make you choose between 2 children.
Yeah.
And then they'll drug you to the point you don't even know what you're doing. And you can
The
do
choices,
it.
yeah.
That's scopolamine and other cocktails of drugs on a scale not seen by governments.
Just to have that choice of either having to hurt a child or a child dying, it's just inhumane. Like, it's just absolutely horrific.
Mm-hmm. And then I was brought into people's houses. Like, my father had teacher friends with very young newborn babies, and I'm only 7. And we've all gone over to their house, and I'm the one left there, a 7-year-old. This is like 2 teacher parents allowing my father to talk them into leaving their newborn twins with a 7-year-old while they go up the road and have drinks. So they're fully under, walked out of the house, and I'm sitting there really tense, hoping and praying that one of the babies won't wake up, because I don't know what to do with a crying baby. And then I hear a chink, like a key sound. So my father's come back and picked up the keys, not that they needed to, but just to show me that they can get keys to any house. And then eventually they came back maybe 2 hours later. And by then, I think the boy baby had woken up, and I was attempting to pick him up and hold him while he cried. And then the other one was just waking up the girl just in time. So they were monitoring it to see when they would. And then all of a sudden, the mother and father are brought back in. Oh, here we go. Oh, great job.
Wow.
7-year-old.
Leaving a 7-year-old with such little babies.
Mm-hmm. But you can talk people into anything on scopolamine. So they just exited willingly. I've had a situation where I've even told one of the handlers where to go and find the bleach to put into my eye much later, because that's what these combination of drugs do.
Just consciously incapacitated. It's just running. running without that conscious thought.
I didn't have much to do with my nana and granddad. We'd moved from their town to another town. They occasionally came over, but they were always under. And I remember it was my first time I was allowed to have a holiday with my nana. And I was lying in the bed that she'd made for me in the spare room. And one of the handlers is next to me, directing me to get up and go to the kitchen and steal the toffees out of the tin. And I had to do this 10 times in a row. Every time I came back, get into bed, I wouldn't see him. I'd be just dozing off again and I'd have to do it again. So it's kind of like you're verging on wanting to go to sleep, but the menacing voice telling you to, you still have to do it. So they're controlling you to do things even when you're really, really tired and under a lot of drugging. And I could hear the snores from my grandparents and knew that they were sound asleep.
Wow.
And then later on that same trip, I remember wondering what my father was doing there, and he'd come and he was saying to my nana at the back door, remember every word to tell her, you've got to tell her the whole story. Then he said to me, you've got to remember every single detail, which is how I was programmed and trained to remember everything. And I remember her taking me outside somebody's house down the street, and I could see handlers standing opposite us. Then I turn my back to them and forget that they were there, but feel quite anxious. And she was telling me this huge story that probably took at least 20 minutes, all about a story about a Maori family and an outcast. And I had to remember it in great detail. And even at one point, believe that I had Maori blood, because they take all your identity and all your ancestry. And I remember that in huge detail.
Wow.
Every word that she said.
And that was
I wrote down almost 45 more years later, word for word, from the detail. And they've used this in other killings as well, which I'll get to later. They can program someone to write heaps of stuff, belief systems, reality things, whatever they want, even admitting to a murder or whatever when they haven't done it under these drugs.
just makes you wonder, like, how many innocent people across the world are imprisoned, through their use of drugs like this, and the tools that they use to get their story across and protect the networks.
Mm-hmm. They can even program you to have a reflex reaction. I remember when I was around 8 years old, I was taken to another friend's house, and her father was a doctor. And I remember being in the kitchen and watching the mother cook the food, and she didn't have any English. They were from Sri Lanka. And then I was brought out, one of my friend came to get me and take her into her bedroom where her sister was, her older sister. And she gave me 2 lollies and I put them in my mouth, both of them. She said, put both in your mouth. I do. And then all of a sudden, out of the wardrobe came a handler. And as soon as I saw him, I had the reflex that was programmed in me to go, and so I swallowed both the lollies and choked. And then he went out of sight. And I remember I couldn't breathe and I had a huge panic attack. And the doctor was trying to help me, calm me down and say, it will go down. Like, they made the lollies so that they knew, the organisation, that they knew that they would fit down my throat, that I wouldn't die, that they would melt and go down, but it was pretty tight. So it took a while. And then afterwards he was saying, why would she have such a reaction like that? There's something wrong, there's something wrong. So he'd been programmed. And all the way home, I was meant to be staying overnight for the first time. All the way home, he's like, I'm going to say something to her mother and father. I'm going to see them. I'm going to say something. And I'm thinking, I don't really know what's going on again, but something's happening. And then when he talked to my mother at the back door, my father wouldn't come. My mother kept going like that with her. like a reflex action, and then covering her mouth like she was hiding something when she was talking with him, because that was another reaction that they can program people to have. So it made her look very guilty, that covering up something. He eventually left. And then my father later told me that they had tortured them out of town, basically. But before that, I went into my bedroom after that, and my mother made me feel like I'd done something terribly wrong. I remember sitting there, and in my mind was programmed, that was your last chance, and you blew it. Yeah, almost there.
Yeah. Like, I've messed up, I've lost it, I'm stuck here, I'm helpless. It's just horrific.
Yeah. And then after that, we were eating dinner, and my father started saying things like, because we had a bantam, which is also significant because bantam has got reference to bantam weight. And there was a whole thing about boxing in the family. Certain family members would do a boxing dance after a killing and things like that. And he was saying that we were eating the family bantam, the family chook. So we didn't want to eat our food. And then later we were taken outside where there are other men. And first of all, my father yelled at my twin brother to grab the pet, and that they're going to chop the head off in front of all of us. And he couldn't catch it. Eventually it was caught because it was drugged, and it started to slow down and slow down anyway. And the head was chopped off in front of us. I remember my brothers all crying. I didn't cry. I didn't really have many tears then. I was pretty blank. Also programmed not to cry. And then I remember other men coming out, and I remember thinking, oh, so these are the men he's training. There are other men. There's so many of them. And then I was put in the shed, in the dark shed, on my own as punishment for something my father said he was going to come back and talk to me about. So he put my brothers to bed and my mother and everything. And then he came back in and said, this is when you try to tell. We kill when you try to tell. So if you ever try to tell, we'll kill. And the next killing was my mother's friend. She had a friend, and she was killed, and we were told that she was killed when she got the phone call to say that she was dead and that they had done it.
Oh my God.
So she was killed because one day she came over to the house, and my mother used to always do all the talking for me, and she'd ask me a question to tell me about something, and she corrected my mother in front of my father and said, no, I want Julia to tell the story, not you, because my mother kept butting in as she did, and she'd talk for me. And so it was said that there was punishment for that as well. That was her punishment. And she was a newlywed, and her husband came over. He was brought over by the organisation crying and saying how much he missed her. And then they were laughing at him. So he was obviously brought over under to be made fun of. And I was stood to witness that as well. And then he was led away by them. So this is the extent they go to.
And that's just reinforcing that anyone that you go to, it's going to be bad for them as well. So, better you just go along with it.
Yeah, and one of the leaders was in there as well, Doc, and he said basically that they were having trouble now as they had an undertaker who was always under to give the right way that people died, which could be covered up. Wow. Whereas now the system was changing, so that wasn't, they had to find new ways. So that was said way back then as well. That was like just past the mid-1970s. So they've really perfected it now. In my next session, I'll be talking more about the Great White Brotherhood and the training, the cult of the family, and how that was taken over by this organisation and told to me. And I'll also be talking about time in Antarctica, which is where they did a lot of their training. back in the late 70s, early 80s, and mid 80s. And I'll also be talking about 2 other murders that I was taken to, one in Australia and one in the UK, and how they orchestrated those murders when I was still under 10 years old. And how they based themselves in New Zealand, because who would ever suspect that they came from New Zealand?
So true. And I feel like Australia gets that coverage as well. It's just like little old Australia, or you just wouldn't expect those kind of things.
Then after that, they based themselves in Australia, and I was brought over for that when I was in my late teens.
Thank you, Nellie, for your recounting. I know that wouldn't have been easy with just so much trauma and so many events that, you know, you've had to process and then now bravely speak out about. And, you know, I thank you from the bottom of my heart for your courage to share these stories, because it's going to help so many survivors understand the deeper layers of their own programming, so we can all heal together, and also help, you know, our communities at large to understand how these cults operate, so we can keep an eye out for all of our children, because at the end of the day, that's what we need to stop now, is the children that are stuck in these systems at the moment. And wow, just thinking that, you know, this was back in the 70s, and look at the control and the techniques and just what they were able to do with the programming. It just it blows my mind. And just to think, you know, where would that be now 50 years later? So
I'm going to be getting to that, as
yeah.
I go forward with these sessions. And thank you so much for giving me this platform. And I'm really feeling that I'd like to keep speaking out for the other survivors, to know that you're not alone.
It's so true. And to all survivors listening, you know, you are not alone. It's all of us here healing and speaking out together. And there's more of us coming forward than ever before. So I feel there's great hope for the future, for what we can do to heal ourselves and heal our communities and raise awareness so this can never happen again. So thank you so much, Nellie. And I look forward to our next chat and our next share of your incredible story. Thank you for being so brave.
Thank you, Gabbi.